have been trying to get David St. John here for a reading for years and years, and tonight is finally the night. I could not be more excited. So, I first met David in 1994 at the Napa Valley Writers Conference. I only had recently decided that poetry was something I really wanted to pursue, really wanted to be part of my life. And David was the perfect teacher. He was enthusiastic and he was so knowledgeable, and he was most of all very kind. So David is the author of 10 collections of poetry, including Study for the World's Body, nominated for a National Book Award in Poetry, and most recently The Auroras, as well as a volume of essays, interviews, and reviews entitled Where the Angels Come Toward Us. He is the co-editor of American Hybrid, a Norton anthology of new poetry. And David has been honored with fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, both the Rome Prize Fellowship and the Award in Literature from the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters, and the O.B. Hardison, a career award for teaching and poetic achievement from the Folger Shakespeare Library. He teaches at the University of Southern California and at many workshops and master's classes around the country, where he continues to be enthusiastic, knowledgeable, kind, and most of all, a terrific poet. Please help me welcome David St. John.
Thank you, my dear. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I was saying to Lillian how much I love that bridge poem with her mother. Just what a knockout. And I've known Lillian's poems for a long time, of course, but I first knew Czesław Miłosz's poems from Lillian's translations, and so I've always felt I've owed her this enormous debt, so thank you. And you know, it's great to be able to see not just Gillian, but to see Stella and to run into Nancy, who I haven't seen since Fresno. And so it feels, you know, it feels very homey to me. Which leads me to say that I was thinking of that Powerhouse poem that Lillian read. And, you know, it's not just children that need a place to be bad. You know what I'm saying? So, welcome to the Barkin Dog. I grew up in Fresno, and my grandmother had this amazing 2 acres of landscape garden that she made herself. When she bought it, it was all fig stumps. And it was this remarkable place, the prize of which were her iris gardens. And in a moment, I'm going to read a poem called Iris about those. And one time I asked her, and I think Gillian may have heard me tell this story. One time I asked her, you know, how did you get all of those 2 acres of fig stumps? How did you get them up? I mean, did you get somebody with a tractor to pull them out? And she looked at me and she said, no, dynamite. And I said, God, you had these guys come in and dynamite those stumps? And she said, why would I pay someone to do that? And she'd gone around and dynamited each of these stumps. So this gives you a sense of the kind of formidable woman she was. This is an elegy for her, and as epigraph, her name and dates are given: Vivian St. John, 1891, 1974. And my daughter is named for her, Iris. There is a train inside this iris. You think I'm crazy and like to say boyish and outrageous things. No. There is a train inside this iris. It's a child's finger, bearded in black banners, a single window like a child's nail, a darkened porthole lit by the white, angular face of an old woman, or perhaps the boy beside her in the stuffy, hot compartment. Her hair is silver and sweeps back off her forehead onto her cold and bruised shoulders. The prairies fail along Chicago, past the 5 lakes, into the black woods of her New York. And as I bend close above the iris, I see the train drive deep into the damp heart of its stem, and the gravel of the garden path cracks under my feet as I walk this long corridor of elms, arched like the ceiling of a French railway pier, where a boy with pale curls holding a fresh iris is waving goodbye to a grandmother, gazing a long time into the flower as if he were looking some great distance or down an empty garden path, and he believes a man is walking toward him, working dull shears in one hand. And now, believe me, the train is gone. The old woman is dead, and the boy. The iris curls on its stalk in the shade of those elms, where something like the icy and bitter fragrance in the wake of a woman who's just swept past you on her way home, and you remain. One of the things I meant to suggest that we start this before Lillian read, but each time, I've read a lot in cafes, bars, different places, but every time, if you have an alcoholic drink, every time the ding of the order up hears, you got to take a drink. Okay? That's my rule. Okay? Just saying, okay? This is a book called Prism. And let me just show you. It has these 16 really quite amazing photo images. I'll find some more for you. Scattered throughout the book. And these are images by an old friend of mine named Lance Petigian. And the book is called Prism. And it's a kind of sonnet sequence, though they're all 14-liners, one is 15. And they're all titled with different colors. And when we decided to do a collaboration, I said, well, what shall we do? And I was thinking, it'd be like a Robert Frank, Danny Lyons, gritty, black and white, rest stops of America kind of thing. And instead, he said, no, let's do something that has to do with color. And I thought, okay, let's try. And so I'm going to read 2 of the poems from Prism. And this first poem is about the Dalai Lama, just so you know. My friends tell me that all of my poems are about the Dalai Lama. But that's why they're my friends. And this has to do with the monk's robes and it's called saffron. Even the thin tube of Spanish saffron sitting on the spice rack above the butcher block cooking table seems to glow with the worth of at least its weight in gold. And today, at the beach, a dozen Buddhist monks in golden robes stepped out of 3 limousines to walk their Holy One out along the dunes to the water's flayed edge, where the sand burned with a light one could only call, in its reddish mustard radiance, the essence of saffron. And what I remember most of the scene as the Holy One knelt down to touch those waves was his sudden laughter and his joy, and that billowing burnt lemon light opening across the sky. I lived in Rome for a year, and this next poem and the one following are both set in Rome. The Corso that's mentioned is just the main drag that runs up through the center of Rome, and there's some, really fancy shopping streets in between the Corso and the Piazza di Spagna that some of you have probably been victimized by at one time or another. As the person, you'll see the person in this poem. And the poem is called, and in terms of the colors, you'll see at the end, the poem is called Bumblebee. So instead of one color, this poem is really about 2 colors. It was such a 50s kind of thing. The astonishing sport coat at the back of the drop-dead expensive Roman men's store I'd passed by almost every day just off the Corso, and sure enough, it was exactly my size. And it's almost impossible to describe the vibrating sense of pleasure, the soft lines of alternating butter and black gave to the haze left in the eye of the gazer, in this case meaning me, as I stood before the mirror, smoothing the lapels along my swelling chest, and the woman beside me, herself just a little breathless, turned and said, "Oh, honey, oh, honey." One of the things that I discovered living in Italy, it's true now as it was then 25 years ago when I lived there, and that's that because of the because of the economy and the problem with jobs and housing, after World War II, housing in Italy came back actually relatively slowly. There were a lot of, outside of Rome, there were a lot of kind of tenements that sprung up. And one of my favorite poets is the Italian, we know him more as a filmmaker, but the Italian poet, essayist Pier Paolo Pasolini. And Pasolini's early books, his novels, were about the boys in those tenements. And he had been a high school teacher for a while until he couldn't stand it any longer. But what it also meant was that young Italians, both men and women, lived with their families until they were very, into late 20s, early 30s. And that meant that one of the few places of privacy that they had were their cars, right? And so this is a poem about that phenomenon, and it's called The Kama Sutra According to Fiat, okay? And, you know, now we have in this country pretty small Fiats that are based on the Fiat 500s that are referred to here called the Cinquecentos. But in fact, in Italy, they're far smaller. They're at least a third again as small. They're so tiny that Italians refer to them as baby shoes, okay? Just so you know. Let me see if there's anything else you need to know here. I lived up on the Gianicolo Hill, one of the 7 hills that surrounds Rome and looks down on the city. There's this sort of large area that has a view down onto Rome on the Gianicolo, where people would come and park, and it would be like, you know, 5, 6, 7 cars deep, you know, 20 rows of cars, 5, 6, you know, and that's sort of the inspiration for this one. It was like an old-time drive-in, except there was no screen, you know. And so what you would see as you came by is described in this poem. And I think that's all you need to know. And piccolo in Italian just means tiny. The Kama Sutra according to Fiat. Up on the Gianicolo, in cars painfully piccolo. The view is a pretext when sex is the full text. Beneath night's starry webbing, all of Rome is out petting. Of Fiat's micro conditions force the oddest positions. Arms and legs in the air, as each lover must dare those slow, floorless dances when making advances. The baby shoes, Cinquecentos, though only meant to go skating down roads, are now littered with clothes. And in the grander sedans, there's a groping of hands that's just as preposterous among the quite prosperous. Still, there's nothing obscene on the sky's black screen, and nothing appalling in cars rocking and stalling. It's all quite delightful, out getting a nightful. And of sexual particulars in manuals vehicular, by far the best we've got is the Kama Sutra by Fiat. Now, just so you know, I'm not making this up. I have to read you a little item from the New York Times that a friend, the poet Jane Hirschfield, sent me when she saw it. And the headline is, "Car-Crossed Lovers Sue." A couple of lovers are suing an insurer for damages, claiming an unplanned pregnancy resulted from a car accident in a love park. Italian newspapers reported Friday that the claim involves an accident in March involving a medium-sized regatta and a tiny Fiat. The man claimed he and his girlfriend were engaged in amorous activity in their small car when the large car hit it from behind. The impact momentarily made them lose control, resulting in the pregnancy. The suit demands compensation for the cost of repairing the Panda and the Fiat and the cost of the wedding. Also, Gillian had asked me to bring a few books tonight, and I thought I'd bring some that would be hard for you to get, and the ones that are collaborations with the artists, Prism with the photographs, and this book, which is called Terraces of Rain, which has these amazing color drawings scattered through it. And they're by a really wonderful, well-known architect and artist named Antoine Predock. I want to read one section of this book-length poem called The Face. And it's in 45 parts. And in it, the speaker has gone through a kind of collapse, kind of breakdown. He's trying to reassemble his life. It's really been interesting because I wrote at the request of a friend who's a composer, I wrote a libretto from The Face that became an opera, and the opera premiered last August. And it's just sort of an extraordinary, wonderful, lucky experience. And this is just a little section about the speaker at this sort of period of collapse, and also the speaker's daughter. It was late May when I began the journal, a record of descents, tours of the abyss, and catalogs of blackness. One morning I woke having dreamt I was the vehicle of aliens. No joke. A stiff, robotic self, impeccably designed to go out into our world and hunt other people. My alien engineers had expected more success, I'm sure. The dream never made it clear exactly the fate of those I'd encountered, though I'm sure my friends might have something to say on this subject. At last, my daughter recognized me. I mean, the me within the me who was the robot transport. And just a touch of her hand in recognition made all of those internal, extra-earthly mini parasites evaporate like dust motes in the wind. Thanks, I said out loud, as I woke to the blaze of sunlight in the bedroom. You're welcome, she said, just there at the bedside, her hand on my head, for God only knows how long. And this is my most recent book called The Auroras. The second section of this book, all of the poems are set in the San Joaquin Valley or the lower Sierras. And each of the three sections of the book is titled, and this is the title poem of this center section, and it's called In the High Country. Some days I am happy to be no one. The shifting grasses in the May winds are miraculous enough as they ripple through the meadow of lupin. The field is iridescent as a Renaissance heaven. And do you see that boy with his arms raised like one of Raphael's angels, held within this hush and this pause and the sky's lapis expanse? That boy is my son, and I am his only father, even when I am no one. This is a poem about my mother, and it was written about 1.5 years before she died. And many of you have probably had the experience of beginning to lose someone before you lose them. And this poem is called From a Bridge. I saw my mother standing there below me on the narrow bank, just looking out over the river, looking at something just beyond the taut middle rope of the braided, swirling currents. Then she looked up, quite suddenly, to the far bank, where the densely twined limbs of the cypress twisted violently toward the storm-struck sky. There are some things we know before we know. Also some things we wish we would not ever know, even if as children we already knew. And so, standing above her on that bridge that shuddered each time the river ripped at its wooden pilings, I knew I could never, even fate willing, ever get to her in time. And one last poem. And it's called Hungry Ghost. And probably some of you have some background in the notion of Buddhism and what the hungry ghost represents. And I won't rehearse that all over again. It's pretty much what it sounds like. Hungry Ghost. When I came to see you, it hurt me how thin you had become in the months of addiction and disease. And although your particular abyss was a man and not a drug, the degradation was the same wasting of the flesh, the same tapped out well emptied of the least leaf of emotion, the same frozen rage. When I came to your hotel room, you were sitting in a hard chair just by the window, half slumped and distracted, looking out at the persistent rain, then silently back at me. Your ghost, your own ghost, had already come. She sat by you at the small table, and she was so hungry At one point, she reached over, reached right inside you, and slowly twisted off a moist wafer of your heart. She put it in her mouth and let it sit a moment on her tongue, her lips parting in a way both petulant and suggestive. It was clear she would eat all of you. I walked into the bathroom, and at the dulled zinc sink, I rinsed one by one the fat spring strawberries I'd brought you from the ranch. I put them in the white ceramic bowl I'd carried from our kitchen, and without a word, simply placed it on the table just beside your ghost. She stared at me, and then only at the fleshy rubies awaiting her, and ate until only a few rivulets of blood traced the bottom of the bowl, and the green crowns she'd torn from their bodies lay scattered where they'd fallen at her feet. At last, she seemed sated, even placated, or bored. She barely looked over as I wrapped you in your overcoat. You glanced at her, and she at you, the rain still steady at the pane. And then I realized you could not stand alone. And so I lifted you up to take you home. Thank you.